There is one area in Toronto that ranks among the most expensive retail corridors in North America. Designer flagships, luxury hotels, storefronts renting for hundreds of dollars a square foot. 60 years ago, the same stretch of land was Canada's hippie capital. Free love, drugs, biker gangs, and a folk scene that witnessed the early days of some of the country's biggest musical stars. This is the story of Yorkville. To understand Yorkville, we need to go back to the 1800s. During that time, Toronto, then named York, was a small, fast-growing port town. Immigrants were arriving by the thousands each year, packed into housing near the waterfront. The conditions were tough, and sanitation was little to non-existent. Diseases, such as malaria and then cholera, were present, and the dominant medical belief of the era was that illnesses came from bad air. With that in mind, two men, Joseph Bloor, a brewer and innkeeper, and William Jarvis, sheriff of the home district, saw an opportunity. In 1830, they bought a stretch of land just north of the town and subdivided it into residential lots. Their pitch was simple: cleaner air, away from the smoke and diseases of the city, for a better life. They named the new community Yorkville. Yorkville grew around two industries. The Yorkville brickyards on the site of today's Ramsden Park produced the yellow bricks that gave many of the neighborhood's original buildings their color, and breweries, including one owned by Joseph Bloor himself. A fun fact, these two industries appear on the village's coat of arms: a barrel and a brick mold, along with an anvil, a wood plane, and a bull's head, all symbols representing the occupations of the 5 founding councillors of Yorkville. Over the next decades, Yorkville grew, but initially just on paper. When the village incorporated on January 1st, 1853, its boundaries were drawn far wider than its buildings. Yorkville was charted across hundreds of acres of farmlands, orchards, and brickyards, with a population just past 1,000. Many landowners subdivided their land into lots. Parcel by parcel, the patterns they chose along Yonge Street and Avenue Road decided where Yorkville's streets would run. Shortly after came the houses. Most of Yorkville's Victorian homes were built from 1870 onwards and were accompanied by a population growth which more than doubled between 1871 and 1881. But growth outpaced what the village could pay for. By the 1880s, Yorkville could no longer afford to run its own services, like roads, water, and other basic infrastructure a village of its size required. So in 1883, it petitioned the city of Toronto for annexation. On February 1st, Yorkville became the first independent village absorbed into the city, renamed St. Paul's Ward. For the next 80 years, nothing about Yorkville suggested what it would become. Through the 1940s and 50s, as car ownership grew and new suburbs opened up around Toronto, Yorkville residents began to move outwards into larger homes. Landlords divided their old Victorian houses into rooming houses, as more tenants per buildings meant more rent, and by the early 1960s, Yorkville had become the kind of place where people with low income, like artists, could afford to live. As a consequence, a local artist community started growing in their neighborhood. In October 1964, a coffee salesman named Bernie Fiddler opened a basement club at 134 Yorkville Avenue called the Riverboat. Within a few years, this space was known as the best coffee house in Canada. It attracted many rising stars of the time, such as Gordon Lightfoot, Joni Mitchell, Simon and Garfunkel, Neil Young, Bruce Cockburn, and dozens of others. By the mid-1960s, more than 40 coffee houses, galleries, and clubs lined Yorkville's streets. At the same time, that artistic scene evolved into something else: hippie culture. And drugs, such as LSD, hashish, and marijuana were a big part of it. So much so that in the summer of 1967, hippies organized a University of Toronto conference on psychedelics called Perception 67, drawing Allen Ginsberg, a leading counterculture icon. There were other significant activities, like the Love-In at Queen's Park, which gathered over 5,000 people with performances by Leonard Cohen and Buffy Sainte-Marie, and the Sleep-In at Nathan Phillips Square. In essence, Yorkville had become Canada's answer to Greenwich Village. But not everyone welcomed any of it. In August 1967, A sit-in on Yorkville Avenue ended with 50 arrests for disrupting traffic. That same year, Ontario MPP Syl Apps called Yorkville a festering sore in the middle of the city that needed to be eradicated. By fall, police had stationed a paddy wagon at the corner of Hazelton and Yorkville Avenues every weekend, and a 10 o'clock curfew was enforced for anyone under 18. To the young people who lived there, it was still the Love Inn, but to the part of the city watching from outside, it was a containment zone. On February 26, 1966, after 4 years of construction, the Bloor-Danforth subway line opened, and one of its new stations, Bay, sat right inside Yorkville, a short walk from the Riverboat and the coffee houses that had made the neighborhood famous. A common consequence of new transit lines is the rise of land value around them, and Yorkville was no exception. But that rise didn't benefit the people who made the neighborhood what it was. Its residents were still mostly renters and mostly poor. The beneficiaries were developers. They saw the opportunity, a stretch of land in the heart of the city, newly connected by subway, still priced like the slum conventional buyers saw, rather than the scene its residents were living. One of them was a Toronto stockbroker named Ian Wookey. He'd made his fortune on a block of Canadian Oil Company shares just ahead of the takeover by Shell Canada in 1962. 4 years later, he turned to real estate, buying a lot at the corner of Avenue Road in Cumberland and a cluster of Victorian houses nearby at Avenue Road and Yorkville Avenue. His son would later describe the neighborhood at the time as a, quote, Class B slum, and his father's approach as simply buy as much as you can to create change. And creating that change usually means pushing existing residents out. But in Yorkville, that step wasn't necessary. By the late 1960s, the scene itself was already emptying out on its own. Part of it was the drugs. In August 1968, a hepatitis outbreak swept through the neighborhood, as biker gangs increasingly sold harder drugs alongside the marijuana and LSD that had defined Yorkville a year earlier. Part of it was something less visible. Hip itself was spreading, and being a hippie no longer required being in Yorkville specifically. Around the same time, Wookey opened York Square. He had removed the interiors of the Victorian houses he owned while keeping their heritage facades, turning them into a small retail complex. Its first tenants weren't countercultural at all, a bookshop called The Bookseller and a salon from London hairdresser Vidal Sassoon. By the end of the decade, the hippie scene had thinned out, and the new vacancies were gladly absorbed by developers. The 1970s were filled with transformations. The first was the opening of the Hyatt Regency Hotel in 1972 at 21 Avenue Road, lot that belonged to Wookey until 1969. In 1973, Wookey started work on a much larger project, a retail and residential complex just north of York Square. It opened in October 1976 as Hazelton Lanes, 60,000 square feet of retail, built on the site of 8 former homes, with tenants that included selected prestigious brands. The Globe and Mail covered the opening plainly. Most shoppers, the paper noted, had dressed up just to walk the stores. The city was investing too. By 1968, the Metropolitan Toronto Library Board had decided its 1909 building at St. George and College was too small and set too far west to serve the region around it. In 1971, it commissioned Raymond Moriyama architects to study where a replacement should go. The board set 2 conditions: walking distance of Yonge Street and the subway, and somewhere between Queen Street and St. Clair. Moriyama's team looked at over 40 locations and came back with 3 options. The board chose Yonge and Asquith, on Yorkville's eastern edge, and approved $7 million to buy the land and $23 million to build. In November 1973, Moriyama unveiled the design. 5 stories clad entirely in mirrored glass, reflecting the street by day and revealing the library's interior at night. Some objected to the extensive use of glass, which would increase heating and cooling costs. Some said the design was too imposing for the neighborhood. Some objected to the cost, with the University of Toronto's overspending on Robarts Library fresh in memory, and some argued the old library should be kept instead. The initial plans were rejected in December 1973. Moriyama spent 4 months redesigning the building. The new design had less glass, brick walls, and tiered floors, stepping the lowest one down to match the buildings across the street. The revised plans were approved in 1974, and ground was broken in February 1975. The building opened on November 2, 1977, and is the largest public reference library in Canada. In 1978, Four Seasons founder Isidore Sharp bought the Hyatt Regency and renamed it the Four Seasons Hotel. It would anchor that corner of Yorkville for the next 34 years. At the same time, something bigger than Yorkville was happening. Through the 1970s, Toronto was becoming Canada's main city. Its population had already overtaken Montreal's by 1971, and corporate headquarters that had called Montreal home for generations began relocating east. One of them was Holt Renfrew. Founded in Quebec in 1837, the company had been headquartered in Montreal since 1937, when it built a 6-story flagship and head office on Sherbrooke Street for its 100th anniversary. In March 1979, it opened an 85,000 square foot store a few blocks from Hazelton Lanes, $6 million, built for exactly the kind of clientele Hazelton Lanes had already proven would show up. Yorkville kept growing through the 1980s. In 1988, Hazelton Lanes tripled in size, adding more premium brands to its portfolio. Over the next decades, the neighborhood's luxury identity survived a recession, and its value kept climbing through the 2000s. In September 2011, Hazelton Lanes was sold to First Capital Realty for $110 million. Around the same time, York Square, the building where all of the post-hippie era had started, came under threat. By the 2010s, rising property taxes had pushed rents beyond what its small remaining boutique shops could afford, forcing its family ownership to sell to private developers. An application to demolish it followed in 2012. City planning staff moved to block that with a heritage designation, and in July 2014, City Council formally protected the site under the Ontario Heritage Act. The dispute over what could replace it dragged on until 2018, when a tribunal finally approved a 29-story tower on one condition: the original Victorian houses Wookey had rehabilitated 50 years earlier had to be preserved and built into whatever came next. 2 years later, a new demolition application came before the city, this time for the entire site, with no preservation built in. City Heritage staff reviewed it and recommended refusal. On October 30th, 2020, the city's own preservation board voted 8-3 to back that recommendation, urging council to reject the permit outright. 2 weeks later, at Community Council, a motion recommended reversing that advice entirely, from refuse to approve, and on November 25th and 26th, the City Council adopted it. Full demolition approved in exchange for a heritage plaque, a set of measured drawings, and a formal, quote, interpretation plan, commemorating the building the city had just voted to tear down. Today, Yorkville ranks among the 5 most expensive retail corridors in North America, just a tier below Fifth Avenue and Beverly Hills, and the highest in Canada. Many of the brands Wookey first brought in during the 1970s are still there, joined by decades of others that followed. The Riverboat's old address on Yorkville Avenue is long gone. A 31-story tower with residencies starting at $10 million is being built where York Square once was. Yorkville has changed identity 3 times in under 2 centuries. Not many places experience this level of transformation. From an escape from a city that made people sick, to, for a few years, a place young people built a parallel universe, to finally becoming 6 blocks of the most expensive retail in the country. And for now, this is the era we get to live through. Who knows what it will become next? If you like this type of content and would like to learn more about the environment that surrounds us, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to this channel. Stay tuned for more!